So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Mike Lanham. I am the Director of Security and Compliance here at Planet Technologies. Prior to coming to work here at Planet, I was a virtual CISO at a security firm in Westchester, New York. And for 5 years prior to that, I was the Chief Information Security Officer for the U.S. Military Academy, dual appointed as a professor of computer science, or an associate professor of computer science. So some of this slide deck is derived from personal experience, as well as some of it is derived from the numerous conversations I had with my peers in the New York State Education and Research Network, NYSERNet, as well as compadres at EDUCAUSE when I was able to attend those various confabulations, which was actually curtailed thanks to COVID. But anyway, Casey, did you want to talk about these first few slides in terms of welcoming and you already own it? Or do you want me to just go ahead and burn through them? No issues. Clearly, ladies and gentlemen, I did not rehearse that handoff with Casey.
Sorry, Michael. I was getting off mute, but you could go ahead and take it away, and I can speak to the program towards the end if we want to do that as well.
Okay, no problem. There is the email address right there on the webpage, or correction, the slide deck, if you want to go ahead and talk to Casey or other representatives of the Arduino program. Today, this is the agenda. It doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a lot to pack into 93 slides, so we've got to get going. Nothing? Nobody? Okay, it's actually not 93 slides, so it's substantially less than that. So just to be honest, and just to go ahead and make some expectations clear, every now and then I may actually call a name out and ask for you to participate in this discussion. So Joseph and Brian and Pickert and Amelia, or Benjamin rather, and James and Justin and several others, I may call on you. I'm just letting you know. It's the remnants of my being a college professor at times. So just to go ahead and make sure everybody has their finger near that mute button to take themselves off mute. So we are going to go through this agenda, and we're going to talk about some of those various elements. But before we do that, I'm going to deliberately try and make sure that some of us are that today anyway, we're talking about the same thing when we use certain words. Now, I'm deliberately choosing to not go to the NIST Standard Dictionary and use dictionary or the definitions out of NIST. I'm choosing to not use the DoD dictionary. I'm just trying to deliberately use mostly conversational English. And now George Box back in the 50s had made something, a paraphrase statement along the lines of all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so in this context, security is a model of a way of doing things, and the same with compliance and frameworks. And if you take a look, I'm going to try and argue that security is doing the needful things to ensure confidentiality, integrity, availability, non-repudiation, and authentication. So that's a little bit more than the standard CIA model, but I did that on purpose. And then compliance, I would suggest to all of us, is an overlapping component of security, but it's about being able to prove that you do security. So you can absolutely do security without any compliance, but you can't really do compliance without security. Would be something that I would choose to argue. Likewise, a framework in this case is a very generic term. I'm not trying to make it align with the risk management framework definition or anything like that, but I'm using it in the sense it's a repeatable and defined process by which multiple stakeholders can use that process to make their lives ideally a little bit more effective and a little bit more efficient. And for those of you in the audience that are longtime security practitioners, I can hear some of you groaning like, I already do security every day. I don't need a framework to help me do it. And fundamentally, that may be true, but I would also suggest that sometimes it's not about us individually. It's about trying to establish processes for our institutions or for the organizations that we're supporting to make sure that we're not a single point of failure. Or if we decide to retire or get a better job or get a lesser job, however you want to phrase that the institution doesn't necessarily have many hiccups when we are unexpectedly departed. And then some expectation management. I'm going to ask, let's see here, Benjamin Pickert, would you agree with that last bullet that compliant organizations can still get compromised?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thanks very much. Would there be anybody in this audience who would disagree with that statement? And I count to 3 silently. Okay. So it is expectation management. I would encourage all of us to make sure that when we are talking to our university leadership and decision makers, that be one of the continuing reminders to them. It was certainly something that I constantly, I didn't need to remind the CIO about it, but the CIO and I both made sure we talked to the university president. We called him the superintendent. And reminded him in virtually every engagement that just because we're doing all of this does not mean that we're not going to get it breached at some point or another. And he was perfectly fine with that, as you might expect coming from a sort of a military background. So the first item on the agenda is really identify the stakeholders. And now it may sound trivial when I say that, but what I mean by this is, especially at the university level, there are all kinds of categories of users that may not normally make it to the attention of the standard IT person or the standard architect for an M365 tenant or something along those lines. As an example, librarians and libraries. So Joe Hudson, are librarians treated as any kind of different users or different type of services in your environment?
Don't really have any librarians in my environment.
Okay.
But if they were, they would not be treated any different.
Okay. And that may be appropriate in some places. In some other places, librarians are often treated as the records managers for an organization or for a university because of their expert knowledge and the fact that most of them have to have a master's in library sciences to even get that job. And so that's one of the possibilities, that it's not necessarily a particular user. But also, if you think about the types of data that librarians end up being custodians for, either on-prem or through some software as a service, they have access to the entire checkout history of the users at their institution. And so that could potentially be an embarrassing factoid, or it could potentially be something that the university would choose to not make public. Diving back into the depths of time, when there was a Supreme Court candidate, Robert Bork, coming up to the Supreme Court, somebody leaked his video cassette renting habits at the time from Blockbuster, if I think it was correctly. And so it's actually ended up spurring one of the few right to privacy laws that Congress ended up passing, that you actually can't release the video rental habits of customers. So that's one example that a set of users on a campus would potentially be custodians of data that might end up being not protected by law, not necessarily protected by university policy, but might need to be protected from a privacy preserving perspective. And likewise, going up to students and parents of bill payers. And so I say parents / bill payers of students. It's another example of a user that would not necessarily make the radar of the average person designing a university environment if they're not keeping their perspective broader than just students, staff, and faculty. Students, staff, and faculty are certainly the principal categories, and hence the reason they're all the way in the upper left as applicants and as also full-time individuals. But bill payers of students, they need to log into some service to be able to pay the bills of those students. The university systems that my boys happen to go to have contracted that out to a different provider. So I have a identity with that software as a service and not the university, but that very much depends on the university itself. So just out of curiosity, would anybody nominate who on a campus might need law enforcement data? Amelia, I'm going to tag you. Okay. So besides the standard university police, there could very well be them, but it could also end up being researchers that are doing research with other elements, especially external sponsors. So it's another example of users that, if our community has people entrusted with helping design and architect IT solutions for the breadth of the university population, if we don't keep our perspective broad enough, we may end up forgetting a certain category of user. When we tend to forget users or discount their needs or don't satisfy their needs, all we do is we generate the opportunity for shadow IT to proliferate across the institution, representing risks to the institution that none of us know about. So I'm going to pause to see if there's any questions or comments, or maybe even some ideas about folks that I left off of this list. Leaf, did you have any ideas about anybody that I may have left off the list? No? Okay. So leaving people off the list is clearly not something what I want to do. Clearly HIPAA is one of those other opportunities. So the next thing that I'd also propose that we do is, when I talked about frameworks being a repeatable process, we need to decide, remember, in compliance is about being able to prove security to somebody that matters. So which frameworks matter? So some of these are frameworks that are not necessarily uncommon to be seen inside of a university. NIST 800-171, NIH guidelines for human subject research and making sure we safeguard that data for human subject research. Potentially Gramm-Leach-Bliley for some public reporting. Privacy Act. Now, does anybody have an idea of why I put those last two entries in red? Joe, do you have any idea?
I would assume it's the
I
fact.
think on the state breach reporting one is oh, sorry, there's a couple, Joes.
There are, my apologies. I was looking at Joe McLean, and then he understood what I was trying to communicate through brainwaves, and then Joe Hudson also sounded off. Sorry.
Go ahead, man. Take it.
I think on the state data breach reporting is how much we work within the OCR and that reporting and where those laws come from, as far as our date constraints, when the reporting has to be apt and all the things that come with it. So I think in a red, that's a highly important thing.
That's absolutely right. Although you ended up pointing out a very valid concern in those state data breach reporting requirements that I wasn't tracking in this particular slide. One of the reasons I put it in right here is everything in black. There is zero private right of action. So if my student records are breached at University X, I can't sue the university. There's no private right of action. The only people that have right of action is the Department of Education, except when it comes down to the state data breach reporting or the state privacy laws. Depending on the state, depending on how they're written, they may have private right of action. Now, the only reason I bring all that up is, CCPA also generally incorporates private right of action and would fall under the state privacy laws. So thank you for bringing that up. My point of bringing this up is sometimes, especially lawyers, might argue that if I can't be sued for it, it's a risk that I don't really need to worry about. Well, okay, that may be one way of looking at it. But if you end up breaching, say, DoD confident or controlled unclassified information that's supposed to be in a secure research environment that ends up getting breached somewhere, what you have is your reputational damage, and you also have potential loss of research sponsors in the future as those DoD sponsors become aware of those breaches. They may choose not to accept your researcher or research group or even a department as a research partner. So this is one of those, although there's no private right of action, and there is always reputational risks with any kind of breach, there can be very direct harm to the university and to the various components of the university. So the reason I brought all this up is if we don't have an idea of the various types of stakeholders that matter to us in the EDU space, then we are going to miss somebody. And if we miss somebody, we are again absorbing some risk to the institution that we weren't deliberately absorbing. And there's a huge difference in my view between deliberately absorbing risk and doing it through lack of knowledge. Would anybody offer any other ideas on identity correction frameworks that would affect colleges? I certainly saw in the chat channel that the CCPRA is one of them, or CCPA, excuse me, California Consumer Protection Act. And if you didn't know this, if you have a remote employee in California, employees under that law are considered consumers. So if you do have remote employees working in California, you do have some exposure to it. And I'm not a lawyer. I didn't stay at Holiday Inn Express last night, but learning what that exposure is, at least to some level, is probably a wise expenditure of resources. GDPR is absolutely applicable, and I am disappointed with myself that I didn't put it in there. Now, to some degree, GDPR can't be enforced at a university level. As an example, the right to be forgotten. I'm not aware of many registrars that are willing to just delete all evidence that a student ever attended a university. There may be other things that the GDPR can be used to impose, but Justin's observation that GDPR will probably apply is probably true because there are likely EU residents that are attending various schools. Yes, the Chinese Communist Party does have a version of something that they call it. Again, I have zero knowledge about it, but yes, I concur that there may be something there. So I'm just taking a note on other types of frameworks that might matter. At some point, does every state who has a foreign student coming to your university, does it put the university at jeopardy? I honestly can't answer that question, and so you're going to have to talk to an attorney. And I'm not even going to apply common sense or anything like that because it's the law. It may or may not have common sense. That was my out loud snarky voice in case you didn't notice. So I deliberately bring in the compliance officer here for a personal best practice that I found useful. When I was first integrating with compliance officers as a chief information security officer, the compliance officers tend to be the ones I dealt with tended to be very focused on a particular aspect of compliance that mattered to them or that was written in their job description. Would anybody be willing to take a guess as to what the principal areas concern that they were focused on? You can do it in the chat if you don't want me to call you. Title IX, yes, absolutely. Human subjects was the one I most often dealt with. And there's a big reason for that because there's obviously clear, oh, you don't see any chat. That's interesting. Leaf, I'll have to figure out, I won't be able to troubleshoot it right now, but I'll have to figure out why. HIPAA, absolutely. HIPAA is another one that tends to end up being very niche, niche, however, and you can't come off mute. Well, that could explain why we were having some pregnant pauses there earlier. So I guess I won't call on anybody anymore. FERPA, absolutely. And so my point with all of this is if you have multiple compliance offices or multiple compliance officers, maybe it would be worthwhile to have a coffee clatch with them every now and then. Let each of them know what the others exist. Number one, that they exist. Number two, it is more likely than not that some of the artifacts that each individual compliance officer has to gather in support of the institution's reporting requirements are repeats of other people's work. Maybe not an entire repetition, like if it's a Venn diagram, there's an overlap, but it's not a complete overlap. But there's likely to be some amount of work there that can be multi-purposed and reused. And if you can do that, then it may allow the university and those officers to get a little bit further ahead of the power curve than they currently are. If they're like most of the folks I've dealt with, there are far more requirements and far more things to do than resources to get them all done. So everything becomes a triage and a prioritization. But if we can share each other's work across multiple domains, it helps. The HIPAA security rule, if you're doing 800-171 in most places of your institution, you're already meeting most of the HIPAA requirements. As one example, if you're meeting the 171 requirements, you are most definitely meeting the generalized statements that FERPA imposes upon institutions. Those are all just examples. That is very disappointing, Leaf, that you can't see anything other than your own chat. We'll have to figure out what is going on with that. It could be a byproduct of being a registered guest, but I don't know. I'll have to figure it out later. And likewise, the economies of scale or licensing for GRC tools. In the chat, would anybody be willing to share what governance, risk, and compliance tool they're using? Because even finding tools that work for multiple domains or even work for a single domain can itself be a bit of a challenge. None. That's not surprising. Okay. So in the vein of you already own it, Microsoft Compliance Manager is, you might be able, no, I would argue, is a poor man's GRC. It didn't start off as a GRC, but it can be used as a GRC with any number of overlays, HIPAA 171, 853 if you needed to go that way. It allows you to do some automated checks inside of the M365 tenant and the Azure tenant. It also allows you to upload artifacts and put expiration on those artifacts. It allows you to generate reports from that entire system. So if you don't have a GRC tool, it might be worth exploring through the You Already Own It program, the use of Compliance Manager, and see if it might work for you. Maybe it will meet some percentage of your requirements. And until you get annoyed at the unmet requirements enough to buy a different GRC, it might work for you. And so I'm offering that as, in my opinion, a best practice within the ecosystem or within the Microsoft ecosystem. Now, earlier we were talking about the types of users that we would have inside of a university environment. And why I bring it up in a slightly different perspective here is identifying the users. Do you want everybody to have just a first name dot last name standardized UPN with whatever disambiguators you use after that when you have collisions like John Smith? It could be that that's exactly what you choose to do. Well, one of the things that I would suggest to you is that you can disambiguate people and categories of users inside your UPN space, as well as inside your display namespace, or maybe the other way around. You don't disambiguate inside the display space. You don't have a need or a requirement to differentiate faculty from students, from contractors, from vendors, but you might want to do it inside the UPN space. Another reason you might consider doing it is having the differentiation as either suffixes or prefixes or some other standardized choice allows you to help do some meaningful identifier disambiguation when you're doing reports and reporting. And so you can actually identify fairly quickly all your system administrators or all your domain administrators. You can also identify if somebody is in a list of administrators that doesn't have the disambiguator, that argues that something has gone amiss. That person was either given permissions that shouldn't have it, or that person, some other kind of process went amiss. And so it's a way of helping do your periodic monitoring of your privileged users when they're controlled in a centralized manner. I will ask this question inside the chat channel instead of doing it verbal. How many university or how many of the attendees here allow user ID UPN reuse? Okay, several, I see a none and a never. Yep, not here, not here. Excellent. So one of the things that, obviously you guys have already figured out is that when you don't allow reuse, you have to figure out some way of keeping track of those that have already been issued. So that goes along with that decision to not allow reuse, is you have to keep some kind of data store of those that have been used. So it's just part of the thought process and design requirements, no big deal. How many of you, in your opinion, have identity managers or identity providers in your environment other than your Azure Active Directory or your domain controllers? So I would submit to you that most of you do, even if you don't know about it. That's right. So AD internally, third parties are a mess. Yes, absolutely. And so there is a reason why I put in that very first bullet up there. If you have the ability at the institutional level to impose institutional policies across the various colleges or across the department, Leaf says, who doesn't have multiple identity managers? Leaf, I've never met anybody who successfully dropped them all down to one, minus the one doctor's office with 5 people in it. And actually, even they didn't, because they also had an ADP and they used a different login for that. But anyway, my point, though, is if you have the opportunity and the ability to reduce the number of identity managers you have, then do so. Mandate the use of SSO while allowing people to say, the software or the service that I need to use doesn't integrate with SSO. So you keep a list of it and periodically work with those individuals to maybe check the current state of affairs for their service provider. Help them understand the risks they're accepting and imposing on the institution and imposing on their user base by using a set of identities that are not tied to the standard university process. Because for every identity management system you have and that you use, nominally, you're supposed to have access control processes for each of them. Well, we can all start sitting there multiplying in our head like, oh, good Lord, I can think of 15 or 20 software as a service products that my university uses, and only 3 of them have SSO. Yes, this is absolutely, and yes, you can absolutely age out risky applications. And inside the Azure space, you can also do some application proxies. So if the application doesn't directly integrate with SSO, you can configure it with an application proxy to allow you to do SSO. But my point in terms of best practices is try and reduce the number of identity management systems you have in play, because every single one of them impose a process overhead requirement. How do you onboard people? How do you offboard people? How do you periodically review people? Who's in charge of that thing as an administrator? And how do you make sure that they themselves are periodically checked that they're abiding by the various university policies they're supposed to abide by? When I say university or college, so university or college in a very generic sense. Now, some of the other reasons you might want to go ahead and add additional identifiers. So you can either do it through UPN or you could do some schema extensions. And this is absolutely one of the ways I've seen multiple universities try it. Sometimes they also do it with their own different identity manager, is helping differentiate non-citizens from citizens. Now, some universities would tell you, I have no interest in ever doing that. And maybe at the student level, that's fine. Maybe. But at the faculty level, especially the research faculty level, being a non-citizen is something that precludes access to certain types of data. So it might be useful to go ahead and have something like that annotated in a schema extension that's not visible to lottie-dottie everybody in the campus. I mean, clearly if it's an LDAP-enabled capability, they can look it up. But my point being, you're not using the information to try and penalize the person in any way. You're trying to use the information to provide security to data that the university or the college is obligated to protect. And likewise, it greatly facilitates the construction of dynamic groups. Dynamic groups greatly facilitates the construction and use of conditional access policies. So if you can avoid static groups, avoid them like the plague, dynamic groups are certainly one of the better choices for use. Quick question for the audience here in the chat channel. Do you do any kind of bulk onboarding or offboarding for all the students that come in the spring, or the fall, or all the students that graduate in the spring? Or is it very much a individualized process? Maybe it's a workflow through the registrar that says they're graduating. I'm curious what the chat channel will show. The institution I was at, we generally had 900 people graduate in May, so we did bulk offboarding. We generally had only about 30 or so graduate in December, but we also had 1,200 or so on board in the last week of June. So we had to figure something else like that. Yep. Registrar, yep, absolutely. In my particular case, the registrar was a little late in the process because we had people show up in June for training all summer before they even started classes. So they may end up being a trainee and then decide to leave the institution before they actually registered for classes. Okay. What about for employees? Does anyone have high confidence that your HR data for onboarding and offboarding people is well integrated with onboarding and offboarding IT accounts? Anybody have high confidence? Who has, we got one high confidence. That's awesome. And so going back to that list of users in your environment, every single one of those categories of users, what we're trying to do is drive through, do we have a process that onboards them correctly, offboards them correctly, and allows us to do efficient review of current accesses so that we can do it in a fairly routine manner. That's the whole point of being able to do compliance, is doing routine security. Get a CSV from HR, absolutely imports that into AD. Yep, I've seen that as well. I've also seen integration with the contracting element of various departments being able to feed data in for vendors and the names of employees from the vendors that need access. As an example, multifunction devices and printers. If that's a university-wide contract, then the purchasing department ends up with a list of all the people that are authorized to do access and maintenance of those systems, and that ends up helping provide that bulk onboarding and offboarding. And so my point of bringing all of this up, and for some of you, it may be redundant and potentially even pedantic, and for others, maybe it's like, oh, yeah, I'd forgotten about that category of user. How to make sure they get onboarded. Onboarding is generally self-enforcing. I can't get access, and so the person is motivated to fix that. Offboarding them can sometimes be a challenge, especially for categories of users where the person's gone, but they're not really gone. Emeritus professors that are on sabbatical, students that are on medical sick leave for whatever reason, faculty that are on medical sick leave, or staff. So all of those, sometimes you may leave them active on the university system. As an example, emeritus professors are generally that way. But if they're on sick leave, maybe the university or the college or whoever is issuing the account says, when you are not able to represent the institution, we are not going to let you represent the institution. So we're going to disable your account, but not delete it. Sideboarding, I like that phrase. So other types of categories that we've been talking about, and other types of data stores that that frequently exist, that don't necessarily rise to the level of leadership's attention until something happens. Now, I get that there's a valid reason for that. Leadership has a very small, let me rephrase, they have a window of attention that needs to move across many areas of interest for the entire university. So they rely on the rest of us to be professionals and grown adults. And when the counseling services is running the counseling services, they rely on the counseling services leadership to work with the IT and work with the security to make sure that counseling services data is not breached. And yet we have peer counselors, students. So in some ways, they have dual personas. They're a student and they're a student counselor. Do they use multiple personas in your ID system, in your IDAM? Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. An example of another type of role that would potentially be brought into the institution is maybe you have a local emergency operations center at the county or town or city level, that when there is a county, city, state, not normally state, but it's county, city, or town emergency, that the university has some liaison role with that EOC, or the EOC has an ability to inject data straight back into the university very quickly. And maybe having an account to do that is one of the ways to do that. Likewise, the other types of accounts that are listed here, sponsored guests as an example, a researcher. Maybe that's done with the office business to business collaboration capability. Maybe it's done with a business to consumer. It almost always suggests B2B. And likewise, your non-person accounts. So when you're doing your definitions and you're doing your decisions on how to do your naming conventions, keep track of these other various categories. And it may go back into your naming conventions of how do you disambiguate users. Does anybody actually have accounts for their Board of Visitor members? I know my institution did, but we only activated them when the Board of Visitors was actually meeting. I'm waiting for the chat message to pop up, and that's why we have that momentary silence. And Joe did bring up a good point that when people go from a executive or a professor status into a consultant status, how that overlap sometimes happens. It has to end up being one of those processes. If we don't have the process, then we're all we're doing is we're absorbing some level of risk. Can we define the risk? I would submit to you that more often than not, no, we can't define it, but we do absorb it. Likewise, what about admitted but not yet on the campus persons. So earlier we talked about the registrar helping do onboarding of employee or students. Do they get an account as soon as they register or as soon as they've paid their money? It came up at one of chat comment was the whole question of accounts for Board of Visitors came up when the Board of Visitors weren't doing their annual cybersecurity training because they weren't employees. So that's certainly one way of interpreting it, and you can write it in your policy that way. You could also choose to write into your policy that lottie-dottie, if you've got an account at our institution, then you're going to abide by our rules. Okay, you can choose to write a policy like that. Just keep in mind that sometimes enforcing policies ends up being a bit of a challenge, but it sometimes is useful to have a policy in place by which you can take potentially negative action against a person if you need to. And going back to disambiguating user identities, it really, really helps in helping to identify your privileged users. Now, I would also recommend to everybody that define in your policy what is a privileged user, and it goes a very long way with your discussions about what is your accreditation boundary for whatever framework you're using. So if you're only doing CMMC for a particular sub-element of the institution, that's great. If you're trying to apply a framework across the entire institution, then it's a slightly different discussion. But as an example, you could choose to say that, by definition, student computers are not university managed computers. So anybody who has a privileged account on a student computer is not a privileged user in the context of the university. That's a useful distinction to make. It may sound pedantic, but if you ever have an external evaluator come in, they're going to want pedantic. It also helps to set the minimal acceptable qualifications for what the institution expects for training. Does anybody have a mandatory training catalog for various privileged users, or is it just in the job descriptions or something else? And I'm going to put that as a question for the comment section. Do you have a minimum training requirement, or is it just in your job descriptions or something else? So far, I have not seen any typed messages. It's on the list of things to do. Roger that, Joe. That is a probably perpetually growing list, even when you work things off it. So as you come up with how to write it up, don't forget that you've got some peculiarities out there, and you, I'm not sure why I said that. You're in the EDU space. You know you've got a bunch of special unicorns, but leave room in your definitions that maybe a person is a privileged user, but they're privileged user in a very confined scope. So in that confined scope, you could enumerate what levels of training that you want them to have. So an example, the grad student who is the lead grad student in a research center, it is also the administrator of all their computers. Well, if that is true, then, and you want to build that into your policy structure, you can define what you want them to do for training. Maybe the university has a particular training course. Maybe you actually send it to a Microsoft training class. Whatever you choose to define it, track it, try to enforce it, live up to what you write to what you end up doing. Likewise, yes, some areas require training before you get access, in particular FERPA. Likewise, the counseling services. Peer counselors should have whatever kinds of training is appropriate for peer counselors before they get access to other students' counseling records. So some universities don't treat the counseling services as a medical provider, so they're not actually treated as HIPAA medical providers, but they do have privacy obligations. So that's another reason why having that conversation with multiple compliance officers around the institution can help establish that that set of rules is great for that environment. It's overkill for this environment. Knowing that and then writing it down and living up to it helps the institution outlast our presence or any one of our individual presence at the institution. And going back to that very beginning, expectation management, just because you have tools inside the Microsoft ecosystem that support identity management in the Microsoft ecosystem, Don't forget all those other places you have other identities. So that tie in to other identity managers, most of those you end up having an administrator role somewhere in there. And so who's doing that? How do you keep track of that? And maybe the answer is you don't control it, you delegate control and you mandate reporting, that people report back what they're doing on behalf of the institution, not to tie their hands, but to allow risk information to flow upwards and let leadership know what kinds of risk the institution is absorbing. This looks very similar to what we were talking about earlier in terms of identities. Knowing where your protected and or valuable data resides. I would I would posit to all of you that it's not about protecting individual computers. In some ways, it's not even really about protecting individuals, although identity is the basis of most all security elements. It's about protecting the data that we need to protect, either by law or by reputation, by some form of value, intellectual property, some other kinds of information we just flat don't want to make public. Athletic programs. Does anybody know where their athletic program stores the performance data for their athletes? And is that even valuable data? I'll ask that question first. In the chat channel, somebody tell me if they think performance data for NCAA Division I students is valuable. Nobody's biting on that yet. Yes, absolutely. SANS Institute has any number of information security policies you can absolutely borrow. And yes, if somebody wants to make bets, you can absolutely use that data, especially if you have access to it as an insider form. So it's an example of if the IT group and security group doesn't keep track of the idea that there are other elements of the institution with collections of valuable data, it wouldn't dawn on them that the athletic director has a pile of data that is potentially very valuable. And it also might not dawn on them that there needs to be a discussion with the athletic director. How do you give that data back over to the students when they leave? Because at least in some colleges, in some areas, that's not considered, correction, the physical therapist and physical trainers are not considered medical providers. So they don't fall under they don't use the standardized health electronic health record system. So they may use something else. They may use a customized application for athletic programs. So just keep in mind that build this list. When you have this list of where your important data is, you have a place that you can start. Now, I didn't say you have to try and solve cancer across all of them at any particular whack, but you can do one at a time. You can even do 2 or 3 in parallel if you need to. Alumni data, clearly valuable. Collaboration suites in the M365 environment, clearly valuable. Data mining, potentially valuable, especially if it has a lot of PII in it, and getting access to the data warehouse is something that you want to control. So my institution ended up having a data mining review committee so that to get access to the warehouses that the institution was aware of, then people had to submit their research request to that review committee and then describe how they were going to protect the data that they withdrew from the warehouse. Yes, that they are aware of. That is always a key requirement. So somebody wrote into the comment there, Leaf did, as a matter of fact, that for data warehouses that the institution was aware of. Absolutely. One of the goals of a group of people I worked with at one point in my past was compliance through seduction. We wanted to make life simple enough and smooth enough that people would come to the university IT staff to help solve problems before they just started trying to create solutions on their own. Because if we could get to that point, then we would greatly reduce the propensity of shadow IT, shadow collections of valuable data, then loss of valuable data, especially loss through carelessness or loss through negligence. Identifying the systems that matter and identifying the systems that are inside your accreditation boundary. It matters. Doing logical segregation matters. PCI DSS. I've seen any number of well, let me rephrase this differently. I have talked with individuals who aren't exactly forthcoming in their PCI DSS questionnaires. And so if they ever do actually have a problem, they're going to get in trouble because their insurance claim will probably not cover it. They could end up losing the ability to process credit cards. And otherwise, their integrity can get put into question, which is something most of us don't want to go ahead and throw away. Likewise with business units. You can call business units colleges if you're a university level. You call it departments. You could call it research centers. You could call it anything you want. But if you're going to choose to delegate authority to your business units, enumerate the responsibility and enumerate the reporting back up the information channel. So that way there's not an effort to establish control. It's an effort to establish responsibility and information flow. And then that way it is a way of reducing the angst of, you're at the university, you can't possibly understand my research center's needs. That's true, I can't. If you want to go off and do it on your own, here's how you do it. And are you prepared to go ahead and put the resources toward that? I would not argue that I had universal success, and my peers and other persons of EDUCAUSE have not had universal success. And it's an ongoing balance between how much do you delegate, trust but verify, and then just not at all trust. Some frequently not at all trust because people got burned. I would submit to you that personal devices, almost always leave them out of your accreditation boundary context. But then as you are attempting to go to some third party that matters, you can assert that you have a level of control of personal devices, but you don't manage them. So that's one of the principal reasons you could use mobile device management. You could also use MAM if you wanted to do a lighter touch, and you can have those requirements in place. And depending on your environment, your students, faculty, and staff may be okay with these, and they may not. At least in several environments I've partaken in and or talked with peers, the leadership was perfectly willing to have a faculty member complain that they couldn't use their jailbroken phone to access university resources, and they weren't interested in changing that deviation or allowing that deviation. But write what you do what you write, put it in the policy, and it certainly makes things easier. Likewise with your conditional access policies, I would recommend, if none of you have already done the troubleshooting, keep every single one of them as simple as you can. You can have 15 or 20 checks in a conditional access policy. The error message doesn't tell you which check failed. So having multiple checks in a conditional access policy can make fault isolation substantially harder. And what are you going to do for unknown devices? Ladies and gentlemen, if you are of the opinion that you can identify all the devices that are touching your system, because CMMC says you have to, look at how you write your policies, because it can be an unknown device, but you can still allow access to it. Arbitrary terminal at a hotel business center can log into your SIS, as an example, as long as they have a user ID, password, and MFA. They can't download anything. Maybe that's one of your mitigations. But you can still identify the category of unknown devices and use that as your policy declarative, that you allow unknown devices with certain characteristics, maybe from certain parts of the globe. Certain parts of the globe is somewhat problematic because VPNs are rather trivial to employ. So just because somebody is with an IP in Russia doesn't mean they're in Russia. And if they have an IP in the United States, it certainly doesn't mean they're in the United States. Now, believe it or not, that's the end of it. We're about to go into questions and answers, or questions in particular. But did anybody happen to notice that what we just talked about was zero trust architecture? Identity, device, the data being accessed. If you know those three, you have the three inputs into the access function. Then you have a policy orchestrator, conditional access, to decide whether they get access and how robust that access is.